I'm Lila, and I'm horizontal.
I'm Zhana, and I'm horizontal with Lila.
Sex positive culture.
It's my body to give.
Are threesome gifts a thing?
Taking a bath.
I like your bed.
Horizontal.
Horizontal.
This is Horizontal with Lila.
I feel like a little bit closer. Come a little bit closer. Come close. In this episode of Horizontal, I lie down with Dr. Zhana Vrangalova. Dr. Zhana is a sex scientist, researcher, and professor of human sexuality at NYU. She has a PhD in casual sex. Oh, all right. Her PhD from Cornell is actually in developmental psychology with a focus on casual sex. But she did co-found the Casual Sex Project, thecasualsexproject.com, a website that allows people to share stories of real-life hookups in a science-y, data-driven sort of way. If you listen to episode 3 with Mistress Lee, this is the website that a dominatrix codes. At the Hacienda Studio, Dr. Zhana hosts Sex Science Socials, in which she wades through peer-reviewed studies on topics like infidelity, squirting, and bi-curiosity, and breaks the data down in a way we can all understand. She believes popular sex myths ruin lives, and spends her time both debunking those myths on drzhana.com, that's DRZHANA.com, and also replacing those messages by working to make sex ed as accessible as porn. You can read her breakdowns of scientific data on Facebook and Instagram. The Dr. Zhana icon, wearing her trademark glasses, is the stamp of legit sex science. As I like to think of it, Zhana makes sex safer, saner, and better informed, because she uses her given name, and she's such a well-respected, badass, female force for sex positivity in the world. Zhana's example inspired me to come out in a way, to publicly proclaim my sex positivity and the fact that I live in a sex-positive community, a choice which led to this very podcast. I am proud to call Zhana my friend. In the first half of our episode, recorded at Zhana's apartment in Bushwick, we talk about sex ed in Macedonia, liking older boys, the jets at the recreation center pool, my first time, and the cartoon that inspired Zhana's very first masturbation session, and just a little bit about butt plugs. So hey, come lie down with us. Maybe we should scooch the pillow a little bit. It's actually best if we share a pillow.
Okay. Let's do that then.
Yes. Oh, Zhana. We've never been so cozy before.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Hi.
so nice. Hi.
Is that better?
Oh, that's way better.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that sounds good to me.
Perfect.
Yes. Okay.
Let's do it then.
Zhana, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Macedonia. It's a small country in Southeast Europe. Very small, 2 million people. And I was born and raised in the capital, Skopje. I was there till I was about 23, 24. And that's when I moved to the U.S.
What was it like to be you growing up in your household?
Well, it was interesting, I guess. I mean, there were several phases, I guess, of my growing up. The first 8 or so years, we lived as a family with my mom and dad and my sister, who was 2 years younger than me. And we lived like most other Macedonians lived. You know, Macedonia at the time was part of Yugoslavia, a larger country that was socialist in political kind of orientation, and it was very middle class. Everybody was middle class, so we all grew up middle class with, every family had kind of the same, had one apartment and one car and summer vacation and winter vacation. And nobody was poor, nobody was rich, and we kind of all, had the same thing. So we went to kindergarten, which was free, we went to school, which was free. And that's kind of how it was up until 8 or 9 when my parents got divorced. Growing up during those first years, I got a lot of education from Dad on pretty much everything that he knew, which was math and physics and chemistry. And we had a very close relationship of that kind, which somehow my sister never got. But yeah, it was what it was. And then my parents got divorced when I was 8 or 9. And I stayed with my dad, and my sister went to live with my mom, and that was another complete different part of my life where I didn't actually have a very good relationship with my dad. My dad is not a very nice person, which I learned during that time. And I kind of started living on my own, at least emotionally and socially. I mean, I still live with my dad in the apartment, but I went out and partied, and I kind of felt like I was raised by the people on the street that I was partying with. And that went on for a while.
What was their relationship like before they got divorced?
Awful. They fought all the time. My dad was extremely controlling, and my mom was kind of going along with it, and there were constant fights. And, the fights mostly consisted of my dad's monologues that went on and on and on and on for hours. And yeah, I always thought that my mom should have divorced him way, way sooner. But so I thought that was a good decision for her to make.
What were they fighting about?
I don't know, everything and anything. He was, I don't know how much I want to talk about this, actually.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. I don't know, I mean, what are we talking about, really?
I want to know
about?
What lessons did you draw from your parents' relationship when you were a kid, and how did they change? What did you learn about relationships by watching them fight?
I mean, I don't know if I learned a particular lesson, because that was only, one example of relationships amongst many other ones that I could observe, whether from my extended family or friends or TV or whatever. But it certainly didn't look very good, right? They were fighting. He was controlling. It didn't seem like things were going very well. There was no physical violence of any kind, but I don't know.
I feel like my parents were really the only model that I saw. I feel like I didn't get to intimately observe really any other models. So what other models did you have?
I mean, we were pretty close with neighbors. So I had the neighbors across the street who seemed to have a pretty good, loving relationship. I saw the neighbors downstairs who also seemed to, have a pretty uneventful kind of relationship. Then my cousins and their parents. So yeah, I had other models.
What did you learn about sex growing up?
I knew sex was a thing. Nobody was hiding that. In fact, in first grade, there was some experimental program that they tried to push through that included very straightforward, very kind of educational, reproductive and sexual health class. It was supposed to be an entire semester or an entire year-long course. And it never happened, but we did have the books for it. So when you went and bought all the books for, first grade, or maybe it was second grade or something like that, that came included. And so at that point, I guess maybe it was third grade. I don't know, because at that point I was living with just my dad, I think. And so my dad sat me down and we went through the entire book. We didn't know if they were going to teach it in school or not, but he decided that we should go through the book, and he sort of explained everything, and we read. And it was pretty good in terms of what reproduction was like and the fact that sex happened and intercourse and all of those things. It was all presented in a very heteronormative, long-term relationship, monogamous type context, of course, but at least it was accurate within that context. I also had a lot of personal experience up until that point with masturbating, because I was masturbating since I was a little girl, since I was like 3.
Can you remember that early or one of the first experiences of that?
Yeah. It was to a Tom and Jerry cartoon.
Really?
Yeah.
What Tom and Jerry cartoon? The creator somewhere is rejoicing.
I don't think they're alive anymore, but it was... What was happening in that episode, oh God. Tom was supposed to care for another cat, and he was left alone, and he was supposed to make sure that this kitten really was taken care of while the owner was gone or something. And instead of taking care of the kitten, he invited, or maybe all of the neighborhood cats invited themselves in, and so there was a whole mayhem happening of everybody kind of trying to care for this kitten. And one of the things that they were doing were, they were wrapping him in diapers and kind of rubbing him and putting some talcum powder on him and stuff like that. But they were basically handling that region of the kitten's body. And for whatever reason, that made me think that I should maybe try and rub that part of my region against the sofa that I was sitting on and watching this cartoon. And so I did, and it felt really good. And so I kept doing it, and it just kept feeling really good. And then at some point it felt really, really, really good. And then it was, kind of calmed down, and I kept watching the cartoon.
Wonderful.
So I think that was my first experience with masturbation. And then it just went on and on and on. I kept masturbating pretty much throughout my entire childhood.
I can't remember the first time that I did, but I did learn at some point that rubbing myself against something felt great. Mm-hmm. And we had those beanbag chairs that were really popular in the 80s.
Yep.
and in a spare room that was like the playroom or the den. And I would create a little mound out of a piece of the beanbag chair and hump it.
Yep.
Until it felt really, really good. Mm-hmm. And I used to do that alongside a friend of mine. And I guess my mother must have, or somebody must have walked in on us at some point, because I don't remember that happening, but I do remember that they discouraged me from seeing her again, as though it was her. I don't think it was her, I think it was me. But, and that didn't stop me.
Yeah, it's funny how parents react to those things, and this is completely normal, right? So many kids do this. Probably not all of them, but a very large majority of kids have some of these kinds of experiences, whether just with themselves or with another friend, cousin, sibling. It could be anybody, neighborhood kid. And it's perfectly natural. It's perfectly normal. I mean, at that time, you're not thinking about this in a sexual way, the way you are as an adult. It doesn't have that meaning. It's just the physical sensation that feels good.
And we weren't even touching each other.
Yeah.
And we weren't even touching ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. We were just
humping. Yep.
We were just...
It's usually how it starts.
Rocking back and forth. And then later I discovered that if I put my legs up at the edge of the bathtub, then the water could shoot a stream right down, and that felt wow. And I could move around, and I could rock myself up and down, and side to side, but up and down was better. And then as soon as I was finished, I was like, and like climbed down, and I'm done now. And I also used to do that with the jets at the recreation center pool. I used to just hang there on the edge with my arms crossed. La, 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 and try to keep my face straight. And I don't know if I, made little shudders when I was finished. And then I swam away.
Like nothing ever happened.
Like nothing ever happened.
Yep. Pretty common.
So you had already discovered pleasure. When your dad went through the book with you, did he mention that this was pleasurable, or did he just say straightforwardly, this is how babies are made, this is reproduction?
I don't quite remember, but I think there was no doubt that there was pleasure involved. I don't think he was hiding that. And I mean, my parents weren't particularly strict in terms of sexuality. They weren't hiding stuff. My mom was often, they had been nudists, and they would walk around the house naked or topless or something like that every now and then, not all the time, but it wasn't unusual for that to happen. And it wasn't a household where, if a scene came on the TV, that they would turn it off or ask us to leave or anything. So it was pretty, incorporated in life. I feel the fact that, sex exists and it's fun and it's pleasurable and it also makes babies, but that's not all it's for. And so I think that was kind of all incorporated.
It's so healthy, I think, to destigmatize nudity in that way. For adults to just walk around. It's not something to be ashamed of. We are all naked under our clothes.
Yep. Not big deal. Nothing.
Yeah.
And what was I going to say? Oh, I wanted to say something about that. I lost it.
So then you said on the street. I imagine you don't mean on the street, right? You were partying. You were hanging out.
Yeah, I was partying. I was hanging out.
So what did teenage Zhana learn about relationships? When did you get into your first relationship? Romantic or sexual?
This is very intimate. It's very, intimate questions.
It's an intimate podcast.
All right. Well, I've never talked about any of this.
Okay.
With anybody. So I've tried to stick to the science stuff. So, yeah. What's the point? What?
The point is to allow people to eavesdrop on conversations that feel private so that they feel more comfortable speaking about things that are quote unquote private because it's harming people not to be able to speak about these things. That's the point.
Okay.
So talking about things that are, and most people have said, oh, I haven't told anybody this, oh, I can't believe I'm telling you this, this kind of a thing. But that's the point. For me, that's what I want to bring into the world is intimacy dispels shame. Intimacy allows us to see our humanity. Intimacy allows us to be more relaxed about what we want and who we've become and who we have been. It's sort of my desire to do what Cheryl Strayed does in her advice column, not by giving advice, but by sharing the raw stuff, So let me think.
All right, what did teenage Zhana learn about relationships and sex? Well, it was a very fascinating time of teenage Zhana's life because as she was 12, 13, 14, I was hanging out with people who were older than me. I always found it more interesting at that time to be hanging out with older folks. So
Me too.
Yeah, I could learn more from them. They were having more fun. They were doing all these crazy
Driving
things.
cars, having tattoos.
Right. Well, not driving cars really in Macedonia, but yes, that's part of the American experience. But certainly, I mean, there were like junior parties where the younger kids could go up until 11:30, and then the senior parties at the club started at midnight, and then they would go on till 4 or 5. And there was a time in Macedonia and Yugoslavian history when things were a little lawless, so you could get away with a lot of stuff. So I kind of looked older, and I would always get into all of these clubs. Nobody ever got carded or anything. But if you didn't look the part, you might get turned away. I just never did. And also, my friends were older, so I, could get into a lot of trouble in that way. So I went out, and I would stay out late and party and hook up with people and have a lot of that kind of fun. And I guess during that time, I did learn, what I was learning was about the gender roles that we were supposed to play, right, that were expected of us, that guys were allowed to a lot more freedom in their sexual behaviors, that they could hook up with multiple people and still be the stud, right? And that if I did that a lot, then I would be labeled a slut. And that always bothered me. It's funny, I never really cared too much about what other people said about me. I was actually very often completely oblivious to what people thought about me. I was a pretty happy, high self-esteem kid who was just enjoying life, and didn't matter that much to me what people would say. But I would notice these things. I was aware that these things were happening. And the way it affected me was more like, oh, interesting. So this is going on. So, I'm going to be labeled a slut, and that's not a good thing. And my response to that was, well, fuck you. Like, I'm still going to do what I want to do. And if that means pushing boundaries, and if that means living on the margins, then so be it. I like that. I like being a rebel. So I was kind of a little sexual rebel from the very beginning. I didn't have that many relationships. In fact, I had mostly casual encounters. I did have a couple of relationships. But
I was really wondering that about you, because as a person who, I've been hard on myself for as long as I can remember. My memories are really clear after the age of 12. But even before that, I remember being really hard on myself, being an overachiever, feeling ugly, having low self-esteem. But I always knew that I was gifted. So I had a mix, I had a dichotomy. I had this very low self-esteem about my looks, my ability to get the attention of boys, even though I had charm. And then I had really high self-esteem about my intelligence and my talent. And throughout my life, I've battled myself with perfectionism and such negative self-talk, and have caused myself so much pain because of that. And I really admire your really grounded confidence. And I was wondering, has it always just been there for you? Was there a growth process? How do you come by that self-assuredness? I've grown a lot since then.
But you've worked on it.
I've worked on it tremendously. And I wondered if you had, or if it was really a gift of yours.
I don't know. I think it was a gift. I don't think I ever worked on it. It was just there for me. I always had, pretty high self-esteem around my intellect, and I knew I was smart. And I mean, everybody was telling me that all the time. So that I had no doubts. And throughout this whole time, right, I was partying and doing crazy things that 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds should not be doing. And at the same time, I was getting straight A's in school. Like, I would always do my homework. I would always ace everything. I never had anything less than an A throughout high school and then college and all that. So that was something that I credit my dad with, that he installed that love for knowledge and science and value that knowledge, and information and studying is a good thing, and I've carried that with me for the rest of my life. So I never compromised that. All the craziness that I did after homework was done. But at the same, so that was one side, and the other side, in terms of looks or other aspects of who I was just who I was. I don't know to what extent it was oblivion to what people thought about me. I think at some point I was a little chubby. I mean, and I'm not even sure if this is true, but I think it might be, but I was never aware of that. I always thought of myself as cute and pretty and attractive. And I'd never had any doubts that I could attract people. And I constantly did. I was very flirtatious from a very early age. I mean, I was a highly sexual being, period. You know, someone who's been masturbating since she was 3, obviously, is a highly sexual being. And I always got positive feedback that people did find me attractive and did find me interesting and wanted to hang out with me and wanted to hook up with me if it was sexual. But I always had people. I never lacked people in my life. Friends, guys, girls. I had more guy friends than girlfriends, but yeah.
I was super flirtatious as well. And I had not much, I think, return on my investment of flirtation. I remember it's possible though that it only stands out because it was painful, right? Painful memories are just indelible. And I remember when I was in 7th grade, which was right before my parents got divorced, which was probably at the height of their arguing in the kitchen, I was a cheerleader, and I had a crush on this tall basketball player, Brian Dolan. He was a twin. And
my mind went to the gutter immediately.
And you, as a cheerleader, would choose someone to cheer for in this particular cheer, right? So, my name is Lila. I cheer for Brian because he can D-O-I-T do it. He can D-O-I-T do it. Yep. And I cheered for him, and he got mercilessly teased.
Because you were cheering for him?
Because I cheered for him. Lila likes you. Oh. And he got so brutally teased that I never cheered for anyone again. I would go, my name is Lila. I cheer for... And just stomp my feet, which was part of the routine. I cheer for... Because he can D-O-I. So...
That's awful.
That was hard.
That hurts.
That was painful. And I remember my flirtation being curtailed. You know, people saying that I was too huggy, too touchy, too flirty, too.
Was that with your own peers in terms of age?
Yeah.
Did you ever try to hang out with an older crowd? I know in the U.S. that's much more difficult.
I did, actually, because I had a friend named Liz, and I was actually in a play at the recreation center with her older sister. Her older sister played, this was my very first play that got me started as an actress. I played Toto, the dog, in The Wizard of Oz. I have a really cute picture of this. And my friend's older sister played the Wicked Witch. And her group of friends, because I would go over to her house to hang out with her sister's friends. And so and I probably went there so much because I got positive feedback from my flirtation from those boys. And we would play card games and Never Have I Ever drinking games, and one of them kissed my back once. It was very sexy. And that's interesting. I never realized that that's probably what set the tone for my constantly looking to older men later. That I lost my virginity when I was 19, which is quite late for.
It's above the median.
Yeah, and it was with a 30-year-old man. And I had always, even when I was a teenager, been interested in men in their 20s, men in their late 20s, guys who worked at coffee shops, guys who worked at the Renaissance Fair with me. But I never had even oral sex until I was in high school, and didn't have penetrative sex until I was in college. And for me, it was because I wasn't taught that sex was wrong either. I was taught that it's a great thing, it happens between people who love each other, it's lovely. And my mom said, I hope you won't have sex while you're in high school, but if you want to, I'll take you to the doctor, we'll get you birth control, get you condoms. And for me, that permission precluded the transgression. I didn't need to rebel.
Right.
There was no need for that. So I could just make my choice. And I could wait. And I was not waiting for marriage. I dabbled with Baptist kids in my 8th grade year. And they were all like promise rings and things like that.
Oh, I see.
I was not waiting for marriage. I was just waiting for it to feel right. And it never did. And truthfully, when I lost my virginity, it still didn't.
Didn't feel right?
No. I at that point, there were so many men who I had wanted to be intimate with who turned me away because I was a virgin.
Oh, interesting.
That I started to see my virginity as a burden and something to be dispensed with sooner rather than later. And it didn't feel right. But this man had an apartment in Soho, and I was really, really attracted to him. There was just always a dissonance between us. But I was pretty gaga for him for a while. He had started a company and sold it. Now he was writing in cafes all day, and he was writing a memoir about his last lost love. And that should have, tipped me off to the fact that he was not really available to me, right?
Yep.
And I think because of that, because that encounter, he may have had some care for me. I think he had some care for me, but it lacked emotion of the kind that I was longing for. And I think that more than anything is why it was unsatisfying. I remember very little about the actual encounter. I was very afraid because I'm super tight. And I was always super tight in my vaginal exam, pelvic exam, when I went to the gynecologist. I was afraid. I hated putting a tampon in every time it hurt. I was so uncomfortable there. I thought, oh my God, it's going to hurt so much. It's going to hurt so much. I'm going to bleed everywhere. It's going to be so painful. And he had a back surgery, and he had Tylenol with codeine. And I said, can I have some codeine?
Wow.
And he gave me codeine. And I took it, and it didn't hurt.
Better living through
didn't
chemistry.
Hurt. It also didn't feel like much of anything at all. It also didn't feel like much of anything at all. And I was confused because I loved it so much when he bit he was where I got a lot of my predilection for biting and hair pulling and spanking. He was the first person to do all of those things to me. And I loved all of that. I got so turned on when we did those things. I didn't understand why it just wasn't that great when we had actual penetrative sex. Not actual, but when we had penetrative sex. And I remember lying there afterwards, and the windows were on the right, and there was no view. It's like the back of the apartment building on Wooster Street. And I looked out the window, and I thought, that's it?
That's all there is?
That's sex? Like, that's what the movies are about? That's what the novels are written about? That's what the plays are written about? Like, that's sex? That can't be it. That can't be sex.
It think that's a pretty common experience, actually, for a lot of people and a lot of women in particular, and a lot of women in the U.S. in particular.
Why in the U.S. in particular?
Well, in comparison to some, say, Northern European countries, because very often there's not a lot of education, not a lot of positive thinking around it, not a lot of, experience leading up to that. There's a lot of guilt and shame associated with it. So there's, studies finding that when you compare, say, experiences to first sex in Sweden versus the U.S., there is a lot more guilt and shame reported by the U.S. kids than the Swedish kids, and the opposite for pleasure. The Swedish kids are a lot more likely to report pleasure during their first sexual experience, or specifically penetrative experience, than the American kids. And the women, even less so than the men, because of all the double standards and because of all the additional repression that women get growing up.
I don't recall feeling any shame.
Yeah, I mean, for you, it must not have been that.
Oral sex felt great. And I was a young adult woman at this point. I wasn't a kid anymore. This guy.
Also the reality is that for a lot of women, these other things do feel better than penetration, period.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's still the case, that you might like oral or manual sex better than penetration, but there are a lot of women for whom that is true.
Not anymore, but honestly, it's only because I recently have a partner where I don't use condoms. Now penetrative sex feels good to me. We did our research. We did our tests. We waited the amount of time we needed to, and so we were having a much safer sex experience. But it made all the difference for me. I think a gynecologist did actually tell me that I was tighter than most women.
Okay.
That I was legitimately, it didn't just feel that way. I was actually tighter than most women. And lube made a huge difference in my life. Once somebody said, "Oh my God, girl, Astroglide," that changed things a lot. But really, it just wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't that great for me. I did it. It was okay. I much preferred a tongue. I much preferred external clitoral stimulation. And now I love penetrative sex. It's also with someone I love. It's comfortable because we know each other's bodies.
Right.
We have started to experiment. So it's really, the conditions are prime for me to feel receptive.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's a lot more intrusive act than external clitoral stimulation, whether with fingers or toys or tongues or whatever. So a lot more potential for injury, a lot more potential for pain, if there's not enough lube, so all of those things play a role.
Yeah, and I would get fissures a lot.
There you go.
And then the next time, of course, I would feel even tighter because I'd be like tightening up. Oh, I'm afraid. Am I going to get fissures again? I don't want fissures again. Which
cycle
is the opposite of
what you want. Yeah.
Of what you want. Can you define kinky for me?
No, I really can't.
Excellent.
It's really difficult to define kinky because so many people define it in so many different ways.
Can you define it for you? Can you make a personal definition rather than a universal definition?
Okay, that's easier to do. I guess it would involve things that are outside the norm. And that is one of the common definitions of kink, even more universally, things, whether desires or actual acts that are desired or engaged in by a minority of people. And maybe specifically like a relatively small minority of people, something like 10% or 15% of people who might be into that or doing that. So that's one way of thinking about it, just kind of in terms of statistics and numbers. How frequent is this? But those things can change too, right?
Yeah, so if you and Kenneth educate the masses and make sex ed as accessible as porn, then nothing will be kinky anymore?
I think some things still will be kinky because there are fetishes and sexual interests and desires that are pretty uncommon. And the reason why they're uncommon is not because people don't know about them or people feel ashamed or guilty doing them. It's simply because people are not into that.
They don't want to.
Yeah. So those things are going to remain relatively uncommon no matter how acceptable they become, right? As you make things more acceptable, certainly more people are going to think about those things, are going to experiment with certain things, and they're going to feel more comfortable trying them. But that doesn't mean that. And so certain things that have been forbidden or unacceptable before are going to become more common, but not everything, right? So I think there are always going to be things that remain in that uncommon end of the spectrum. But also I think kinky can be thought of as something that's outside the norm in terms of what's appropriate, even if it is common, because there are certain behaviors or desires that are quite common, yet our society doesn't deem them acceptable. And that's what makes them kinky rather than the fact that they're not very common. So things like threesomes, for example, or spanking, or sex with a stranger, even with the tall, dark stranger in a dark alley or something like that. These kinds of things, as fantasies at least, they're quite common. The majority of people have them at least at some point in their lives, yet our society often deems them not okay or not normal or not acceptable. So you can think about these things as kinky in some way to some extent. But that is a very, very broad definition of kink. If you want to take it a little more narrowly, then you would focus more on things that are part of the whole BDSM fetish kind of spectrum that require a little more than the occasional hair pulling and ass slapping to count as kinky.
I consider myself kinky, but I'm probably kinky light.
Kinky
Lite.
I have huge appetite.
The second half of this episode has been released separately by popular demand. Horizontal's badass theme music was created by Alan Markley, on Instagram as Plastic Cannons. Its saucy cover art was designed and illustrated by Shauna Shea. Shauna is spelled S-H-A-N-A, and Shea is S-H-A-Y. Hire Shauna for her character illustration and graphic design skills through 99designs.com. Horizontal was mixed and mastered by Owen Muir of Self-Disclosure Productions, right here in Brooklyn, New York. Stay tuned for Owen's own podcast, Self-Disclosure, a show where people talk openly for the first time about their experiences with mental health. To sign up for the Horizontal show notes, exclusive subscriber content, and sensual horizontal photos, head to horizontalwithlila.com. Do you consider yourself kinky?
Sometimes.